"The estate," said Mr. Aldous Fitch, setting a leather-bound document upon the breakfast table with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a great while to do exactly that, "passes to the Duke of Ashford by noon on Friday. I trust you will have your personal effects removed before then." Prudence Fairweather looked at the document. She did not look at Mr. Fitch. She had found, over the course of 3 years managing Fitch's correspondence while he served as creditor's representative to her late father's estate, that looking directly at Mr. Fitch tended to give him the impression that he had said something worth responding to. She picked up the document instead, turned to the 3rd page, which was where these things always became specific, and read the clause that had ended 4 generations of Fairweather tenancy at Alton Grange. It was not dramatic. It was arithmetic. Her father had borrowed against the property in 1803 and again in 1806, and the interest had compounded with the mechanical patience of a thing that does not sleep, and the estate's income had not been sufficient, and now it was Friday. Prudence set the document down, aligned its edge with the edge of the table, and said, "What time on Friday?" Mr. Fitch blinked. He had clearly expected something else. Tears, perhaps, or an appeal, or the kind of helpless confusion that would have made his errand feel generous by comparison. "I beg your pardon? You said noon. Does the Duke's party arrive at noon? Or does the transfer of possession complete at noon, and his party arrive subsequently?" "Aye. The Duke's steward will arrive at 10 to begin the inventory. Then I will have the household accounts and the inventory ledger prepared and ready at 9:30. Prudence folded her hands on the table. "Is there anything else, Mr. Fitch?" There was, as it happened, nothing else. Mr. Fitch left 40 minutes later with the expression of a man who had not gotten what he came for, and Prudence sat alone in the breakfast room of the house she had managed for 9 years and permitted herself exactly 2 minutes of stillness before she stood, straightened her spine, and went to tell the cook. She had no intention of weeping over an arithmetic problem. The night that Mr. Fitch delivered his document, the great houses of the county were preparing for the Haverford Autumn Assembly, 3 weeks early this year, because Lady Haverford had decided that October fog was depressing, and she preferred the September roses. Every chandelier in the Haverford ballroom blazed. 300 candles had been polished and set in their brackets by 4 footmen, who had spent the better part of the afternoon on ladders, and the result was a room that appeared to be on fire in the most flattering possible sense. The flowers alone, hothouse roses in cream and blush, arranged in urns that stood to shoulder height, had cost more than Prudence's father had earned in wool any year before 1800. The women who moved through that room had been dressed by their maids for 2 hours prior. Their hair was built up and ornamented with ribbons and seed pearls and tiny sprays of real ivy, and their gowns moved with the kind of deliberate grace that requires a great deal of practice and a corset fitted by someone who has not slept since Tuesday. And at the edge of all that arranged magnificence, seated at a writing table that had been pushed to the far wall to make room for the dancing, was Prudence Fairweather. She wore her brown wool dress, which had been her best dress for 4 years, and would continue to be her best dress, until something changed in a way she could not currently calculate. She had a ledger open on the table before her, not the Haverford ledger, which was not her concern, but the Alton Grange household accounts, which she had brought because she intended to have them finished and annotated before Friday morning. She was the Haverford housekeeper's cousin, which was why she was permitted to be here at all, and she had made herself useful by managing the seating cards for the supper tables, a task that had taken her 45 minutes and would have taken the housekeeper 3 hours, because Prudence had committed to memory which families were currently not speaking to which other families, and arranged accordingly. That task was completed. Now she had her ledger, and the assembly's excellent candlelight, and she was working. She noticed the Duke arrive because the room changed when he entered, not dramatically, not with any visible commotion, but the way a room changes when something heavy is set down at one end and the floor redistributes the weight. He was tall and dark-coated, and he wore his authority the way certain men do, as though it had been built into the structure of him rather than added afterward. He moved through the receiving line with the efficient courtesy of a man completing an obligation, and he did not look at the roses. Prudence returned to her ledger. She had reached the entry for the east wing roof repairs, £17 in materials, which she had negotiated down from 23 by sourcing the tile from a merchant in Gloucester rather than the local yard, when she became aware that she was being observed. She looked up. The Duke of Ashford was standing 12 feet away from her writing table, and he was not looking at the dance. He was looking at the ledger. Or rather, he was looking at the woman who was working at a writing table in the corner of a ballroom during an assembly, and his expression was not the social performance that men of his position generally offered to people they noticed at parties. It was something more careful than that. It was the look of a man who has just seen something he was not expecting to see, and who has decided, quietly, to pay attention. Prudence held his gaze for one measured moment, then looked back at her accounts. He did not approach her, but he did not look away for some time, and she was precise enough in her habits to notice that too. She had been precise in her habits since she was 17 years old, which was the year her father died, and she discovered that the estate she had grown up believing was a stable and well-managed property was, in fact, a ledger full of debts and optimism in roughly equal measure. Her father had been a kind man and an imaginative one. He had believed that wool prices would recover, that the southern tenant farms would become profitable with one more season of patience, that the creditors were gentlemen enough to wait. He had been correct about patience and wrong about everything else, and he had left behind 2 servants, a sister-in-law who arrived from Bath within the fortnight to assess the situation, and Prudence, who was 17 and had been educated for a life that no longer existed. Her aunt, Mrs. Dorothea Fairweather, was not unkind. She was also not going to stay. She had a life in Bath and a husband with his own financial concerns, and no resources to spare for a niece at an encumbered property in rural Wiltshire. She spent 3 days at Alton Grange, during which she examined the accounts, spoke to the solicitor, and arrived at the conclusion that the estate might be salvageable if managed with considerable skill and no waste. "You are intelligent," she told Prudence on the morning she left. "Your father always said so. I suggest you apply it." Then she was gone, and Prudence was alone with the accounts. The solicitor was a man named Mr. Gerald Sims, who had served her father for 30 years and was not going to abandon the estate simply because it was in trouble. He came twice a month, reviewed the accounts with Prudence, and taught her, over the course of 2 years, everything he knew about creditor negotiation, tenant leases, and the management of agricultural income. He did not do this because he was paid to. His fee was minimal and frequently deferred, but because he had watched Prudence Fairweather at 17 sit down with a ledger she had never been permitted to see before and begin to understand it with the focused attention of someone building a structure they intended to stand in. "You have your father's intelligence," he told her once, "and your mother's practicality. It is an unusual combination." It was not a compliment that anyone else offered her, but it was the one she returned to when the work was hard, which was often. The work was managing the household on an income that declined every year as the debt service consumed more of it, negotiating with wool merchants who had been her father's partners and were now, politely, her creditors, renegotiating tenant leases to keep farmers on the land who would otherwise have left for the mills because an empty farm produced no income at all, selling off parcels of timber, carefully, never the old growth, only the harvested sections, to cover the winter provisioning, maintaining the house itself, which was old and required constant attention, with 2 servants who stayed because they had nowhere else to go, and because Prudence paid them as regularly as the accounts permitted, which was not always regularly. She had been doing this for 9 years. She had reduced the estate's total debt from £14,000 to £11,000, which was not a triumph, but was not failure either, and she had done it without selling the house itself, which Mr. Fitch had suggested twice, and which she had declined twice, on the grounds that a sold house was a solved problem that could not be unsolved, and she was not certain she had exhausted her options. She had, as it turned out, miscalculated. There had been one year, 1810, when the wool market had looked strong, and she had allowed herself to defer a payment to the principal in favor of repairing the tenant cottages, when the compound interest had outrun her margin. By the time she understood what had happened, the gap was too large to close without an income she did not have. She had not told anyone. There was no one to tell. She had written the figures down in her ledger, with the precise handwriting she used for everything, and she had continued. She remembered the moment she might have broken. It was a November evening, 6 months after she had understood the debt was unresolvable, and she had been sitting in the same breakfast room where Mr. Fitch had later delivered his news, and the accounts were open before her, and she had understood with complete clarity that she had done everything correctly, and it was not going to be enough, and that this fact was not her fault, and was also not going to be remedied by that observation. She had pressed one hand flat against the table, which was solid oak and 400 years old, and she had thought about what it would mean to become less than she was, to give up the precision, the daily discipline, the work that was real and mattered even when no one credited it, and she had decided, without drama and without drama's consolation, that she was not going to become that person. She had picked up her pen and returned to the accounts. That was the thing about Prudence Fairweather. She was not going to step aside for anyone, including arithmetic. The Duke of Ashford had not personally attended the Haverford Assembly to look at ledgers. He had attended because his solicitor, a quiet, efficient man named Mr. Carey, had informed him that the Alton Grange property, which Lucian had acquired by way of a creditor purchase arranged through Fitch's firm, was managed by the previous owner's daughter, who was still in residence and who had, according to the estate records, been running the property single-handedly for the better part of a decade. Single-handedly, Lucian had repeated. I spoke to Sims, the family solicitor, Mr. Carey had said. He was specific. She negotiated every creditor agreement herself. She maintained the tenant leases. She reduced the debt by £3,000 over 9 years. The property is in better structural condition than properties 3 times its income. He paused. She had no assistance beyond Sims's occasional advice, which she did not always take. Lucian had looked at the report for a long moment. What is her name? Miss Prudence Fairweather. He had come to the assembly because he knew she would be there. Sims had mentioned the Haverford connection, the housekeeper cousin, the fact that Miss Fairweather had managed the assembly's supper seating for the past 3 years as a courtesy for her relative. He had come to see what a woman who had managed an encumbered estate for 9 years without credit or assistance looked like when she thought no one was watching. She was working at a writing table in the corner of a ballroom, at 9:15 in the evening, at a public assembly. He had not expected that. He had expected competence. The report had prepared him for competence. He had not expected to find it so specifically itself, so entirely unconcerned with being observed, so precisely present in the middle of a room designed to make competence invisible. He looked at her for a longer time than was perhaps explained by due diligence. Then the dancing reformed and a woman materialized at his elbow, Miss Celeste Bourne, who was the daughter of Lord Bourne, and who had been pointed in his direction by her mother at every county gathering for 2 years, and who was, by every conventional measure, exactly the kind of woman a duke chose when he was finally persuaded to choose. She was beautiful and well-dressed and socially deft, and she said, in the tone of someone reciting a line she had practiced, Your Grace, I had not heard you would be attending. I was not certain I would be, Lucian said, which was the truth, though not the whole of it. He returned his attention briefly, precisely, to the corner where the writing table stood. Prudence Fairweather was not looking at him. She was working. He thought about the estate. He thought about the £3,000 of debt she had reduced, without any instrument of power beyond her own exactness and persistence. He thought about the tenant cottages she had repaired in 1810, with income she could not afford to spend that way, and how the tenants were still there, which meant the income was still there, which meant she had been right. He made a decision that evening. He did not announce it to anyone, because it was not yet a decision that had a shape anyone else would recognize, but it settled into him with the solidity of a thing that has been true for some time before it was named. He would not displace her. He would not simply arrive on Friday and receive the keys from a woman who had earned the right to give them, and then send her to Bath, or wherever dispossessed daughters of encumbered estates were sent. He had come to acquire a property. It had come with a person. He was beginning to understand that the person was the more significant acquisition. He asked one question at the assembly, not of Miss Fairweather. He did not approach her that evening, because whatever he did next needed to be done correctly. He asked a footman, quietly, which of the supper tables had been arranged by the housekeeper's cousin. The footman pointed to the left side of the room. Lucian looked at the left side of the room. Every family that was not speaking to another family was seated at a careful distance. Every title that required precedence was in the correct position. There was not a single awkward adjacency. He had been to assemblies where the seating alone had produced 3 quarrels before the soup. This room was going to have no quarrels. He did not say anything. He simply filed it away, with the precision of a man who collects evidence before drawing conclusions. She had been 3 weeks at Ashford Court before she understood what the house needed. The first morning, Lucian's housekeeper, a stout, direct woman named Mrs. Laura Finch, who had managed Ashford Court for 22 years, and who delivered her initial assessment of Prudence, with the economy of someone who has learned to read a person in the first 10 minutes, had shown her to the rooms prepared for her, and said, simply, "The West Wing accounts are in disorder. The last steward kept them himself, and he has been gone 4 months. I have done what I could." "May I see them?" Prudence had asked. Mrs. Finch had looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has offered a task expecting refusal and received acceptance instead, and said, "I'll have them sent to your sitting room by 9. That was the practical domestic welcome. It was not warm in the conventional sense. It was warm in the sense that mattered. It was real. The accounts arrived at 9. Prudence spent 4 hours with them and found, by 1 o'clock, that the West Wing's provisioning costs had been overstated by £112 over the preceding year, that 3 quarterly payments to a supplier named Cobb had been entered twice in separate ledgers, and that the kitchen garden's output had never been credited against the kitchen's purchasing costs, which meant the garden's genuine contribution to the household had been invisible for at least 3 years. She wrote all of this down and presented it, without fanfare, to Mrs. Finch at the end of the day. Mrs. Finch read it twice, set it down, and said, "He should have put you in the steward's office." "I'm not certain that is what he intends," Prudence said. "I'm not certain it matters what he intends," Mrs. Finch said, with the comfortable authority of someone who has been running a house long enough to have opinions about what is actually necessary. "What matters is what the house needs." She paused. "Will you have tea? I have it at 4:30, and you look as though you have been working since before breakfast, which I suspect is true." It was true. Prudence had been working since 6. The house was large, not disordered, because Mrs. Finch ran it with genuine competence, but large in the way that a complicated system becomes large when it has been without skilled oversight at the administrative level. There were 14 tenant farms attached to the Ashford estate, 4 of which had lease disputes unresolved for more than a year. There were 2 outstanding creditor agreements in which the interest terms had not been reviewed since the previous steward's tenure, and one of them contained a clause that would allow the creditor to demand early settlement at a rate Prudence estimated was £600 more than the estate's current liquidity could comfortably absorb. She found this on her 4th day. She sat with the agreement for 2 hours, working through the arithmetic 3 times, and then she wrote a careful memorandum in which she identified the clause, calculated the risk, and proposed 2 alternative renegotiation approaches with estimated costs for each. She was not certain what to do with the memorandum. She was not the steward. She had been offered rooms at Ashford Court by the Duke, who had met her on the morning of the transfer, standing in the entrance hall of a house she had managed for 9 years, prepared to hand him the keys and the ledger, and a complete annotated account of everything she had maintained, and everything she had been unable to, and who had looked at the annotated account for a long time before saying, not unkindly, "Miss Fairweather, where do you intend to go?" She had had no good answer to that. "I have a cousin in Bath," she had said, "and Mr. Sims believes there may be a position as a companion to a family inn. I have a West Wing in disorder and no steward," the Duke had said. "I would find it useful if you would remain." It was not a compliment. It was not a gesture of charity. It was an operational assessment, delivered in the tone of a man who has identified a solution to a specific problem and sees no reason to obscure the fact. Prudence had recognized that tone. She had used it herself, often. She had remained. Now she was at Ashford Court, with a memorandum about a creditor clause and no formal role that permitted her to act on it, and she was trying to determine the correct channel through which to deliver the information. She left the memorandum on the table and went to the library, which she had been using in the evenings, because the library at Ashford Court had better candlelight than her sitting room, and a fire that was managed by a footman who seemed to understand that a fire was meant to produce heat and not merely the appearance of heat. The Duke was in the library. She had not expected him to be there. She stopped in the doorway. He was standing at the far end, reading, and he looked up when she entered and said, "Miss Fairweather." "Your Grace, I beg your pardon, I was not aware." "Sit down," he said. "There is no reason for you to leave." She sat down. She brought her work. She always brought her work. And she opened her notebook and continued with what she had been doing, which was a draft analysis of the 4 disputed tenant leases. For 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. Then the Duke said, "You found something in the creditor agreements." Prudence looked up. "How did you know?" "Carrie mentioned the West Wing accounts. You found the doubled entries within the first day, which he expected. The creditor agreements are the next logical place to look. He paused. He also mentioned that the previous steward had been sloppy with the interest reviews. There is a clause in the Whitmore agreement, Prudence said. Paragraph 7, subsection 3. The early settlement trigger is written with a floating rate, indexed to the London market, not the agreed fixed rate. If the London rate continues at its current level, the clause activates in approximately 8 months. The demand, at that point, would be for full settlement plus a premium. The Duke was quiet for a moment. How much? £640 above your current liquid reserve by my estimate, which is conservative. She hesitated, then added, I wrote a memorandum. I was uncertain where to send it. Send it to Carey, he said. In future, send all of it to Carey. He will know which of it requires my attention directly. In future, as though her remaining was assumed. She returned to the tenant leases. He returned to his book. She noticed, at some point, that the fire had been built up while they were both in the room, and she had not seen a footman enter. She looked at the Duke. He was reading. She looked at the fire and then back at her notebook and decided not to remark on it. It was something a person who was paying attention would do. The opposition arrived, as opposition generally does, in several forms at once. The first was Lady Bourne, who came to call with her daughter Celeste on a Tuesday afternoon, with the stated purpose of welcoming the Duke to the county, and the unstated purpose of confirming that whatever arrangement he had made with the woman from the encumbered property was temporary and had not changed the calculations she had been conducting since his arrival. Prudence was in the morning room when they arrived, reviewing the lease redrafts that Carey had returned with his notes. She heard the carriage and did not move, because the morning room was where she was working, and she had not been asked to move, and she had learned not to relocate herself on the basis of other people's convenience, unless she had been specifically instructed to do so by someone with the authority to instruct her. Lady Bourne saw her through the morning room doorway on the way to the drawing room, and paused with the particular stillness of a woman recalibrating. Miss Fairweather, she said, with the warmth that is not warmth but the shape of it. I had not realized you were still at Ashford Court. Good afternoon, Lady Bourne, Prudence said. Are you, that is, have you taken on a role here? The phrasing was carefully imprecise, which was itself the point. I am reviewing the tenant lease agreements, Prudence said, which was true, and answered the question without yielding to the frame of it. Lady Bourne looked at the papers on the table with an expression that managed to convey, simultaneously, that this was not an appropriate activity for a young woman, and that it was not a sufficiently important activity to respect. How industrious, she said. Celeste is with me. Perhaps you might join us for tea, when you have finished your reading. Thank you, Prudence said. I will join you when the section is done. She returned to the lease. She was aware, without looking up, of Lady Bourne continuing to the drawing room, with the specific momentum of a woman who expects to win. Celeste Bourne, to her credit, sat in the morning room for a quarter of an hour, waiting for her mother, and spent the time looking at Prudence with the frank curiosity of a young woman who had been trained to disguise her opinions and had not yet fully committed to the habit. At last, she said, Are those the tenant leases? They are, Prudence said. Are they complicated? Lease number 3 is complicated. The boundary description in the original 1791 agreement was never updated when the stream changed course, and the farmer is now cultivating 2 acres that the lease does not technically cover. Celeste was quiet for a moment. And what does that mean? It means the Duke is either charging him for land he doesn't have a right to cultivate, or he has a verbal custom that isn't documented, or the lease needs to be redrawn. I am trying to determine which. Prudence looked up. I find it is usually easier to understand a complicated thing by being specific about what is actually complicated, rather than accepting that it is complicated and stopping there. Celeste looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I think my mother expects you to not be here in a month. Your mother may be correct, Prudence said. I am here today, and the lease needs to be right today regardless. It was the truth. It was also the kind of truth that makes clear a great deal about the person saying it, and Celeste Bourne, who was more observant than her mother, filed it away with something that looked like respect. The second form of opposition was Lord Ashford, Lucian's father, the previous Duke, who had retired to the dower house 4 miles from the main estate, and who arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning, with his walking stick and his opinions, both of which he applied to everything in the room. He found Prudence in the steward's office, which she had been using for 3 weeks by that point, with the tacit permission of Mrs. Finch and the explicit permission of Mr. Carey, who had told her simply that the room was empty and the work needed doing, which amounted to permission in every way that mattered. "You are the Fairweather girl," Lord Ashford said from the doorway. "I am Miss Fairweather, yes," Prudence said. She did not stand. She was in the middle of a column of figures, and she would lose the count if she stood, and she had decided some time ago that she was not going to lose counts for people who announced themselves without greeting. Lord Ashford came into the room, looked at the papers on the desk and said, "My son has made an error in keeping you here." "He has made an assessment," Prudence said. "He has made a sentimental error," Lord Ashford said, "which amounts to the same thing where an estate is concerned. You are not suitable for any position of trust at this house, Miss Fairweather, and the county knows it, and my son will damage his standing by pretending otherwise. The man he should have hired as steward is Jennings, who managed the Calloway estate for 12 years and is currently available, and I have told Lucian so 3 times. Jennings was available, Prudence said, because Lord Calloway dismissed him in March for falsifying the quarterly returns. The discrepancy was approximately £240 over 18 months. Mr. Carey has the documentation, if you would like to review it. She returned her gaze to the column of figures. "I believe your son may have already considered and declined the option." Lord Ashford was silent for a long moment. "That is not public knowledge," he said at last. "It is in the records," Prudence said. "The records are available to anyone who chooses to read them carefully." She finished her count, marked the total, and looked up. "I understand your concern, Lord Ashford. You are correct that I am not a conventional choice for this work. I am not going to ask you to pretend otherwise. What I will tell you is that the West Wing accounts were £112 short when I arrived. The Whitmore creditor agreement had an unreviewed clause that would have cost the estate £600 in 8 months, and 3 of the 4 disputed tenant leases have a clean resolution that your son's previous steward had not found in 14 months of trying. Those are specific numbers. I invite you to verify all of them." She said this without heat. She said it the way she said everything she was certain of, with the precision of someone who has done the arithmetic and does not need the other person to agree in order to know the answer is correct. Lord Ashford looked at her for a long time. Then he left without speaking. She picked up her pen and returned to the accounts. She did not know, because she could not have known, that Lucian was standing in the corridor on the other side of the half-open door, and had been there for the better part of the exchange. He had been walking past. He had heard his father's voice, and then he had heard Prudence Fairweather's voice, and he had stopped. He stood there until his father had gone, and the room was quiet again. Then he walked to the doorway and said, "Jennings." He falsified the Calloway returns. It is documented. She looked up briefly. "I am sorry if you preferred not to know." "I preferred not to have offered him the position to begin with," Lucian said. "I will speak to Carey about formalizing your role." "You do not need to do that," Prudence said. "I am aware that I do not need to," he said. "I intend to." It was not the first time he had done something she had not asked for. That was, nonetheless, exactly what was required. She noted it with the particular precision she applied to things that were not numbers, but were nonetheless worth counting. He had moved her shawl from the stone bench in the garden, where she had left it at noon, hanging it over the iron railing in the covered walk, so it did not take the afternoon damp. He had not mentioned it, and she had not mentioned it, and it had been dry when she retrieved it at 4 o'clock. He had found, in the library, a complete set of the Board of Agriculture's county surveys, which were the reference texts she had needed for the boundary dispute analysis, and which she had mentioned to no one at Ashford Court. They had appeared on the library table the morning after she mentioned them, with no note attached. On the 4th week, she had been working late in the steward's office, later than usual, because the Whitmore renegotiation required a complete scenario analysis before Carey took it to the creditor the following morning. She had not noticed the time. When she finally looked up and became aware that the house was entirely silent, she found, on the side table beside her, a cup of tea that was still warm. She had not heard anyone enter. She had not asked for anything. She pressed one hand briefly against the side of the cup. He was, she was beginning to understand, a man who paid extremely close attention to things he did not announce. There had been an evening in the music room. She had not known it was the music room. She had been exploring the house in the manner she explored all houses, systematically, identifying what was where and what was being used and what was being neglected. And she had found a room with a pianoforte under a holland cloth and sheet music in a box that had not been opened for some time, by the dust on the lid. She had opened the box because she was curious, which she was about everything. The music inside was handwritten, not printed sheets, manuscript, written in a neat feminine hand. The name on the cover page was Margaret Ashford. Below it, in faded pencil, a date, 1797. Prudence had looked at the room, and then at the sheet music, and then she had sat down at the pianoforte, removed the cloth, and played the first movement. It was not a complicated piece. It was a simple piece, played with care, the kind of music written by someone who understood the instrument well enough to know what it could do, and chose to do something quiet with it. She heard the door behind her open. She finished the movement before she turned. Lucian was standing in the doorway. He was not doing anything. He was simply standing there, and his face had the particular quality of controlled stillness she had come to recognize in him, except that something in it was different. Something had opened slightly, the way a door opens a crack in a house where the doors are generally closed. "I beg your pardon," Prudence said. "I should have asked." "It was my mother's composition," he said. She understood, then, the nature of the thing she had opened by opening that box. She was silent for a moment, and then she said, "She was accomplished." "She was," he said. "She died when I was 14. The room has been closed since then." He paused. "I did not close it. I simply never opened it." "There is a difference," Prudence said. "Yes," he said. He came into the room and sat in the chair beside the pianoforte, which was where a person would sit to listen, and he said, "Will you play the second movement?" She played it. The house was quiet around them, and the fire that someone had built up in this room crackled behind them, because of course he had ordered the room opened and the fire lit, she understood now, had ordered it before she arrived, and the music his mother had written was the only sound. She was aware that something was happening between them, building without announcement, the way a wall accumulates from individual stones, each one placed and set before the next one is considered. She did not name it. She finished the second movement, and then the third, and then she set the sheets down and folded her hands in her lap, and the Duke said nothing at all, which was, she had learned, the clearest form of his eloquence. She would have wanted the room open, Prudence said. "Yes," he said again. "I believe she would have." He was watching her with the particular expression she had first seen in the Haverford ballroom, the measuring attention that was not desire, but was something that preceded it, the specific attention of a person who has identified something rare and is in the process of understanding what it means that they have found it. Prudence stood, straightened her skirt, and said, "I should return to the Whitmore analysis." "Carrie can manage the Whitmore analysis," Lucian said. "Sit with me a moment." She sat. They were quiet for a few minutes, and the fire settled. And outside the window, the September dark was complete. It was, Prudence thought, the first time in 9 years she had sat in a room and not been working. She was not certain what to do with the sensation, so she did nothing, which turned out to be sufficient. At last he said, "My father spoke to you this morning." "He did. I heard part of it." He paused. "You gave him specific numbers." It seemed the most efficient approach. She glanced at him. "Was I wrong to?" "No," he said. He said it with the kind of simplicity that meant the question had been considered and answered and required nothing further. "You were not wrong." She fixed his cravat on a Wednesday. She did not plan to. She was walking behind him in the entrance hall when he turned to speak to Carrie, and the cravat, which had been, she had noticed, slightly off-center since the morning, turned with him into the light, and the misalignment became undeniable. She reached out and straightened it, before she thought about it as an action rather than a problem. He went very still. "It has been crooked since breakfast," she said. "I found it distracting." He looked at her for a moment. There was something in the look that she catalogued and did not examine closely. "Thank you, Miss Fairweather," he said. "Of course," she said, and stepped back, and that was all, except that it was not all, and they both understood that, and neither of them said so. The matter of the Whitmore agreement came to a head in October, not through the creditor, but through the creditor's backer, a man named Sir Philip Marsden, who arrived at Ashford Court on a Tuesday morning with 2 associates, and the specific manner of a man who has decided to collect something before it is offered. Marsden was, as Prudence had suspected since identifying the clause in September, not simply a creditor. He was a creditor who had been deliberately constructing the conditions for an early settlement demand for the better part of 2 years, buying up secondary interests in the agreement through associates until he held enough of the note to trigger the clause independently of the original terms. It was neat, and it was legal, and it was precisely the kind of thing that a man with Marsden's experience could do to an estate whose steward was not reading the agreements carefully. He arrived in the library at Lucian's invitation, with Carey and a senior advisor named Mr. Edward Hartley, a retired diplomat who had served the Ashford estate in an advisory capacity for 30 years, and who had been the first person in Lucian's household to tell Carey, when Prudence's presence was becoming a fixture rather than an interim arrangement, that she was the most operationally competent person he had observed in that office since the previous Duke's steward of 15 years ago. Prudence was not, initially, expected to be in the room. She came in with the ledger and the annotated analysis, because Carey had asked for the documents, and she was the one who had them. She set them on the table and was moving to leave when Marsden said, looking at the documents rather than at her, "Is the full Whitmore account here?" The account, the complete interest schedule, the buy-through documentation of the secondary interests, and a timeline of the clause activation, Prudence said, "Yes." Marsden looked up at her then, for the first time, with the specific attention a man like Marsden pays to something unexpected. "And who are you?" he asked, which was a question designed to diminish. "Miss Fairweather manages the Ashford accounts," Lucian said, from his position at the far end of the table, and his tone was not a defense. It was a statement of fact in the register of someone who would be surprised to find it disputed. Marsden recovered smoothly. "The clause in question triggers at the current London rate in approximately 6 weeks," he said. "I am prepared to offer a settlement at—" "The clause does not trigger," Prudence said. Marsden looked at her. His associates looked at her. Carey, to his credit, maintained an expression of professional neutrality while watching. She opened the ledger to the annotated section. The buy-through transactions through which you accumulated the secondary interests were all recorded against the Whitmore original agreement number. But the Whitmore agreement has an attached rider, page 11, section 2, paragraph 4, that requires any transfer of interest to be registered with the estate's solicitor within 30 days of transfer. 3 of your 7 secondary purchases were not registered within that window. She turned the ledger to face Marsden and pointed to the entries. "The specific dates are there, with the registration dates I pulled from the county records. The 3 late registrations account for approximately 60% of your total accumulated interest. Without them, you do not hold sufficient share to trigger the clause independently." The room was quiet. Hartley was looking at the ledger with the focused attention of a man verifying arithmetic. After a moment he said, "She is correct. I see it. The registration requirement is a standard protective clause," Marsden said. His voice was level, but something in it had gone careful. "It has never been enforced. It exists," Prudence said. "Its existence does not depend on historical enforcement. I would be happy to provide copies of the registration records, if that would assist your review." She paused. "I would also note that the irregular registration pattern is consistent across all 3 late transfers, and that the timing corresponds to periods when the estate had no steward, and the registration requirement would have been most likely to be missed. I am not asserting this as a fact. I am noting the pattern." The room heard this. Marsden looked at Lucian, who was watching from the end of the table, with the quiet containment of a man who has already decided the outcome of the meeting and is waiting for the room to arrive at it. "We will need to consult our own advisors," Marsden said. "Of course," Prudence said. "The documentation is here, and copies have been prepared for your review." Hartley, who had continued working through the annotated ledger, looked up. "Miss Fairweather," he said, with the specific directness of a man who has not wasted a word since 1786. "When did you identify this?" "September," she said. "It took 3 weeks to pull the county registration records." Hartley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The previous steward had the Whitmore agreement for 14 months. "Yes," Prudence said. "I know. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing." Marsden and his associates left within the hour. The 3 late registrations would be contested. Carey was confident the estate's position was sound. The contest itself would consume Marsden's time and money for months, which was, Hartley observed quietly to Carey afterward, approximately what Marsden deserved for trying to time a predatory call against an estate in the belief that no one was paying close enough attention. Lord Ashford came again on a Friday, unannounced as before. He found Prudence in the steward's office, as he had on his previous visit, except that this time the Duke was there as well, seated at the secondary table with the county lease maps, while Prudence worked through the quarterly projections at the main desk. They were not speaking. They had been working in comfortable parallel for the better part of an hour, which was, Prudence had come to understand, the form their company generally took. Two people who did not need to fill space, doing their respective work in the same room, and finding this, for reasons neither had articulated, preferable to the alternative. Lord Ashford looked at them both. He looked at the papers on the desk, at the annotated ledger that Prudence had left open on the side table, at the estate maps under Lucian's hands. He looked at the particular quality of the quiet in the room. He said to Lucian, "Carey mentioned the Marsden matter." "Yes," Lucian said. "He said she found the registration clause." "She did." Lord Ashford was quiet for a moment. He looked at Prudence. She was looking at the quarterly projection, which she had returned to, because the quarterly projection required finishing, and she had learned that Lord Ashford tended to speak more plainly when not addressed directly. "How much would Marsden have taken," Lord Ashford said, "if the clause had triggered?" £640, Prudence said. "Conservative estimate." Lord Ashford was silent for a long time. Then he said, in the tone of a man who has arrived at an assessment he did not expect to arrive at, "I was wrong about Jennings. It was not warm. It was not generous. It was the minimum acknowledgement that the arithmetic required, and it was genuine, which meant it was enough." "I know," Prudence said. She kept her eyes on the projections. "I did not enjoy telling you." Lord Ashford left 10 minutes later. The Duke, who had been very still throughout this exchange, returned to the county maps and said nothing, which Prudence had come to understand was his form of marking a moment as significant. The Haverford Winter Assembly was the second Saturday of November, and Lucian attended with Prudence. This was itself the declaration. He had not explained it, and she had not asked, because the intention was evident from the moment he mentioned, at breakfast, that the assembly was Saturday, and that he assumed she would require the carriage at 7. She had said that she would, and she had worn her blue wool dress, which was the best of the two she had brought from Alton Grange, and which was not the kind of dress that women of Celeste-born circle wore to assemblies. And she had not mentioned this, because she was not going to adjust her circumstances by apologizing for them. The room saw them arrive together and produced the particular quality of attention that a room produces when something it has been assuming is made specific. Celeste Bourne was present, in ivory silk, and she looked at Prudence with the frank assessment of someone calculating odds and understanding they have shifted. She was not cruel, she was simply adjusting. Prudence found she had more respect for that than she would have had for indignation. Lady Bourne was another matter, but Lady Bourne was not present in the room in which things were decided that evening. What was present? Mr. Hartley, who had come from his retirement house across the county specifically, and who gave Prudence a formal nod when she arrived that was the equivalent, from Hartley, of a standing ovation. A young woman named Miss Clara Vane, who had been at school with Prudence's cousin, and who found Prudence in the first quarter hour, and said, without preamble, "I heard about the Marsden business. Was it truly 3 of the 7 registrations?" "It was," Prudence said. "Extraordinary," Clara said, with genuine admiration. "I have 2 brothers who manage estates, and neither of them would have found that in 3 years." Clara Vane became, by the end of the evening, the kind of friend who sees a person clearly from the first meeting. Direct, unguarded, occasionally indignant on Prudence's behalf, in a way that Prudence found she did not object to. When Lady Bourne made a remark, across the supper room, about the unsuitability of certain arrangements at certain great houses, Clara said, loudly enough to be heard by 6 people, "I understand Miss Fairweather saved the Ashford estate £600 in September. I cannot think what the suitable alternative might have accomplished in that time." Prudence did not look at Clara. She straightened her spine and took a sip of her wine, and said nothing. She did not need to. The formal inquiry came in December, called by a consortium of 3 county investors who held various interests in estates managed through Fitch's firm, and who had, upon hearing the Marsden matter described in the particular way that things get described in county circles, begun to ask questions about whether the Alton Grange transfer had been managed with appropriate accounting, Their concern was, specifically, whether the debt on the Alton Grange estate had been correctly calculated, whether the compounding had been applied accurately, whether the interest schedule was consistent with the original agreement terms, and whether the final demand was what it should have been. This was, as Mr. Carey explained to Prudence, the most useful inquiry they could have called, because the answer was likely to be illuminating. The inquiry was held in the assembly room at the county magistrate's offices, before the three investors, the chairman of the local agricultural association, Mr. Hartley as an observer, and a room of approximately 40 witnesses who had heard enough about this matter to attend. Prudence arrived with the Alton Grange accounts, all 9 years of them, annotated in her precise handwriting, with every creditor agreement, every interest calculation, every payment record, and the complete compound interest schedule, from the original 1803 borrowing through the final demand. She also arrived with something she had found in her own records from 1810, the original interest rate agreement, signed by her father and witnessed by the then representative of the creditor's firm. The rate on the document was fixed at 3.5%. The rate that had been applied to the compounding from 1808 onward was 4%, half a point, applied over 11 years to a principal of £9,000. The compounded difference was not small. Lucian was seated in the room when she arrived. He had not told her he was coming. She saw him, and she did not approach him, because this was her work, and he understood that, and he had come as a witness to her work, and not as a manager of it. She sat before the investors' table, and she placed the accounts before them. "I managed the Alton Grange estate from 1803 to 1812, she said. "The accounts before you represent every year of that management. I will answer any question you have about any entry." She paused. "I will also direct your attention to the original interest rate agreement, which is the last document in the packet, and to the interest schedule that was applied from 1808 onward. The discrepancy is 0.5%, applied retroactively and without notification. At compound interest over 11 years, that discrepancy represents the difference between an estate that was salvageable at the point of final demand and one that was not." The room was very still. One of the investors, a careful man named Mr. Aldous Walcott, who had the look of someone who has reviewed documents professionally for 30 years, picked up the original interest agreement. He read it. He looked at the interest schedule. He read it. "This rate was changed without your consent," he said. "Without my knowledge," Prudence said. "I believed the rate to be what the original agreement specified. I managed the accounts on that basis. When I reviewed the actual applied rate last month, I found the discrepancy." "Miss Fairweather," Mr. Hartley said, from his position as observer, "what is the specific difference, in pounds, between the debt as calculated at the original rate and the debt as calculated at the applied rate?" "At the original rate, the final balance would have been £9,212, Prudence said. "The final demand was issued at £11,040. The difference, compounded at 4% from 1808 through 1812, is £1,828. The room produced the quality of silence that rooms produce when a large number exceeds all expectations. Mr. Walcott looked at his colleagues. He looked at the accounts. He looked at Prudence with the particular expression of a man who has been reviewing financial documents for 30 years and has not encountered this specific combination of meticulousness and calm before. "Miss Fairweather," he said, "did you bring documentation of the actual payment schedule?" "Every entry," she said, "with dates and receipt confirmations." He looked at the accounts for a long moment. "This is 9 years of accounts," he said, "kept in complete order." "Yes, by yourself." "With Mr. Sims's guidance in the early years," she said, "primarily by myself." The room was quiet again. Lucian stood. He did not speak immediately. He let the room hold what it was holding. Then he turned to the chairman of the Agricultural Association and said, "I have reviewed Miss Fairweather's accounts and found them accurate in every particular. I am prepared to confirm this in any formal capacity the inquiry requires." Then he turned to the full room and he said, "I would also note that the West Wing accounts at Ashford Court have been in order for the first time in 4 years, that the Whitmore creditor agreement has been renegotiated at a saving of approximately £600, that 3 of the 4 outstanding tenant lease disputes have been resolved and the 4th is in final draft." He paused, "and that I intend to ask Miss Fairweather to be my wife, and I would prefer the county to understand that this is not a consequence of gratitude, but of judgment." He walked to where she was seated. He went down on one knee. The room, 40 witnesses, 3 investors, Mr. Hartley, Mr. Walcott, Clara Vane, who had come in the final minutes and was standing at the back with an expression of profound satisfaction, was absolutely still. "Miss Fairweather," Lucian said, "this is not the question I intend to ask you privately. This is the question I intend to ask you publicly, before witnesses, so that anyone in this county who has an opinion about your suitability must form that opinion in the full knowledge that I disagree with it." He looked at her. "Will you marry me?" Prudence looked at him. She looked at the room. She thought about it completely, which she did about everything, and the thinking was not brief. The room waited. He waited. He would have waited considerably longer, she understood, and would not have considered it waiting. Then she said, "Yes, Your Grace." He took her ungloved hand and kissed it, and the room still did not make a sound. And then Mr. Hartley began to applaud, which was so completely unlike Hartley that Clara Vane laughed, and after that, the room had no choice but to follow. The inquiry produced a formal finding that the interest schedule applied to the Alton Grange debt had not been consistent with the original agreement terms. Fitch's firm issued a correction. The matter of damages was negotiated over subsequent months and resolved in Prudence's favor, to the extent that the law in 1813 permitted such resolutions, which was imperfect but not nothing. On a February morning, in the chapel at Ashford Court, with Mr. Sims and Mrs. Finch and Clara Vane and Mr. Hartley present, and Lord Ashford in the second pew with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he did not anticipate and is making his peace with it, Prudence Fairweather married Lucian Ashford, the 7th Duke of Ashford. The private proposal had come the evening before. He had found her in the library, which was where she was, working by habit at 10 o'clock, and he had not said anything at first, but had sat in the chair across from her and been still for a moment. Then he had said, "I want to ask you again." She had looked up. He was not on his knee this time. He was simply present, which was what he always was. "Not because the county should understand my position," he said. "Not because the inquiry has been resolved. Not because it is expedient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes." He paused. "But because when I came to the Haverford Assembly in September and found a woman doing accounts in the corner of a ballroom, I thought I had found something I had not expected to encounter, and every month since has confirmed that. Because you straightened my cravat and told me it had been crooked for 40 minutes and did not apologize for noticing. Because you sat with me in my mother's music room and played her compositions as though they deserved to be played, which they did, and because until you played them, no one had thought to." He was quiet for a moment. "Because the work you do is real work, and I know the difference, and I would rather spend the rest of my life watching you do it than spend it with anyone who doesn't understand what it means." Prudence set down her pen. She thought about it. She thought about what she was being offered, which was not rescue, and was not charity, and was not the transformation of a life she had made into a life she had been given, but was rather the recognition of what she already was by a person who had looked at it directly and not looked away. "Yes," she said. Simply, precisely, in the direct sentence she used for things she was certain of, "I will." He gave her his hand, and she took it. They were married in February, and the household changed the way a household changes, when the administrative intelligence that has been operating through the side door is finally given the front one. Prudence did not transform. The county did not transform. What changed was simply that the work she was already doing became visible, which meant it could be built on, which meant it became more. The tenant lease reforms she completed in the first year were adopted, informally, by 2 neighboring estates after their managers saw the results. She introduced a standardized interest review schedule for all of Ashford's creditor agreements, written up in the clear annotated format she had always used, which Carey distributed to the estate's network of advisors, and which Mr. Hartley, in a letter to a colleague in Yorkshire, described as the most sensible creditor management framework he had seen applied at any estate in 30 years of advisory work. The Alton Grange accounts, the 9 years of them, fully annotated, were preserved in the Ashford Estate Archive. 3 neighboring estates, in the decade that followed, sent their stewards to review them. The music room at Ashford Court was opened properly. A new housekeeper's schedule was written to include the regular maintenance of the room, which Prudence specified in writing, with the same precision she applied to the provision accounts and the lease terms. She played in it on Sunday evenings. often with Lucian in the chair beside the pianoforte, and occasionally with their son, Edmund, dark-haired, and already precise in his habits at 3 years old, which Mrs. Finch observed with the satisfaction of someone who considers it a structural inevitability, sitting on the bench beside her, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. Edmund Ashford secured the succession. Lord Ashford, who had come to look at his grandson one morning in the first winter, and stayed for tea, and said very little, but returned the following week, wrote a brief letter to Lucian in the year after Edmund's birth. The letter contained one sentence that was relevant. "I believe I understand what you saw." It was not effusive. It was, for Lord Ashford, considerable. The life they built was specific and daily, and not dramatic. It was the estate accounts reviewed at breakfast, and the library at midnight, and the cold garden walk in October, when the tenant farms needed discussing, and they both thought better on their feet. It was the cravat, still, occasionally crooked, less often now, which she attributed to habit, and which he attributed, with the quiet precision she had come to know as his form of affection, entirely to her. On an April evening, when Edmund was 4 and had escaped from his nurse, and been discovered in the steward's office attempting to open the main ledger, which was nearly as large as he was, Lucaine found Prudence at the estate desk where she worked most evenings, the lamp warm, and the room settled, and their son's small muddy handprints still on the ledger's cover, because neither of them had cleaned them off yet. She did not look up when he came in. She knew he was there, the way she had learned to know him, which was the way she knew anything, through accumulated precise attention over time. He stood in the doorway and looked at her in the lamplight. She was annotating the spring projections, her handwriting as clear and specific at 10 in the evening as it was at 9 in the morning, and the house around them was quiet and full, and exactly what had been built, from the ground up, by 2 people who understood the difference between a thing that looks like a foundation and a thing that is one. She knew he was watching. He was always watching, and she had learned, without ever saying so directly, that she was glad of it. "Edmund's handprints are on the ledger," she said. "I know," Lucian said. "I left them." She looked up then. He was watching her with the specific expression she had first seen across a ballroom, the measuring, particular attention that had never become less precise and had never become less warm, and that was, she understood now, simply the way he looked at something he had decided to keep. She returned to her accounts. The lamp burned, and the house was still, and the spring projections balanced to the penny, and that was that.